Welcome to the TCG Compass podcast, presented by Amber Grading, a mostly weekly discussion on trading card games and the people who love them.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm joined today by my co-host Grant.
Hi there.
On today's show, we're talking about international versions of the games that we love.
And how they vary and some of the interesting differences.
Exactly. So, Grant, what can you tell me a little bit about, let's say, Magic the Gathering or international versions of Pokemon?
So I think one of the interesting things is depending on, where you live in the world, you have your local, Magic the Gathering Pokemon card shop, and you're always, you may or may not have a lot of experience with the foreign languages of that particular game. Magic has a pretty rich history of printing the game in a lot of different languages. Some more recent than others. Take Italian, for example. You have kind of older sets like Legends, which is back in the 90s, where you have, quite a few copies of big name cards from that set. Whereas things like Japanese printed Magic is a little bit more recent, where they don't have dual lands. Your traditional Badlands, Taiga, Tundra, all that kind of stuff in Japanese. So, you kind of see a little bit here and there. You see a lot of it online in the online marketplaces. One of the things that we don't think about too much is Pokemon's printed in quite a handful of languages these days. But, here in the States, we definitely see mostly English and Japanese cards.
Yeah. Well, to back up there a little bit, when you mentioned that Japanese is a little more recent, I think you hit the nail on the head that it is very, very slightly more recent than is Italian. And the nuance there was that we got Italian Legends, but we got Japanese Chronicles. So when they printed Renaissance, it actually omitted the cards that were printed in Italian from Antiquities and Legends, which was really interesting because you have like this English version of Chronicles, and then you have this Japanese version of Chronicles, which are the same. It's about 120 something cards. And then you've got this other one called Renaissance, which should be the same set, but it's actually much smaller. And it was like kind of confusing for, players back in the day. It's like, why does this set only have like 60 cards in it when this other one that's supposed to be a copy has like 120? But yeah, it's a little weird that we never got Japanese dual lands. And I think a lot of people wish for that because I have seen some Japanese alters where they actually like completely redid the text box in Japanese. I'm not sure if you've seen that.
Yeah, that's one of those things that I think we shared with each other. And we're like, wow, this is actually really cool and kind of like a oddity, in the history of Magic. And, the weird thing about Renaissance, too, is I was in Japan a few years ago, and you can actually find a lot of sealed Renaissance for not a lot of money, kind of all over Japan. And, even for old English stuff like fourth edition, things like it's hard to find in the States. So it's interesting that there's kind of a large quantity of it still existing, unopened to this day.
Yeah, well, there's just not a lot of demand for fourth edition. There really isn't any like hard hitting cards other than maybe like Sylvan Library and I don't know, even versions of like Shivan Dragon. Like, the card was just reprinted so many times that a white bordered fourth edition copy, even in Japanese is really not that cool, just because there's cooler versions out there. But speaking of Shivan Dragon, have you ever seen the 9th edition pre-release foil in Russian? It was only released in Russian.
I don't think I've seen that one.
Yeah, it's got like the more modern Shivan Dragon art on it. It's black bordered because it's foil. And it's stamped, but I think it was because the pre-release was only in Russia that year for that set, which was really strange. It's kind of like a weird pet card, and in the last couple of years, it's like super spiked in value. I think the last I saw, they were around $1,000 online, which is pretty weird for a foreign card.
Yeah, Russian cards in general, I think just the difficulty of getting it out of Russia or Russian speaking countries, there just aren't a lot of, there isn't a lot of supply. Right. And, we can see it here in Hawaii that people love, Russian cards with the Cyrillic alphabet on there. And it's kind of like a nice collector piece. Like the other card that really stands out in my mind is the Questing Felgriffin.
Hebrew? Is it?
I think it's Greek.
Greek? Oh,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was probably the only card printed in Greek. I know that we got a couple Hebrew cards. There's one in Sanskrit. It was like something worm. And then, of course, we got some Phyrexian cards, too. Originally just the Elish Norn for the Judge foil. And then eventually we got the Swamp and Jumpstart. And now we've got the full set of the original Praetors from this last, or one of the last secret layers.
Yeah, and that's the secret layer that has the serialized cards in it, too. So it was a big piece of MTG history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so what can you tell me a little bit more about the international versions of Pokemon? Now, I know that the majority of people in America play with English cards, and in the North American tournaments, unless it's an international tournament, like really you're kind of restricted to those English cards. Like, how does that work? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Pokemon's been pretty, Japan and US centric, or maybe not US centric, but English speaking centric for its entire life cycle. But you see cards that are printed in Dutch and Korean and Chinese. There's kind of I think there's about 11 languages that are supported altogether. But you kind of, because it's restricted from play outside of those countries, you don't see a lot of it. Like in the US, you see English and Japanese. Japanese is purely for collectors, because you can't use it in tournaments. But yeah, for some of the other languages that it's printed in, you just really don't see it being collected or traded outside of their home countries.
Yeah, I can imagine countries like Korea, right? Like it's not allowed to be used in anything outside of Korea unless it's international tournaments. So like, why would somebody in Europe, have a Korean Pokemon card unless they were collecting it specifically?
Yeah, and it's hard to, like, I'm not too familiar with a lot of the languages that it is printed in terms of like their tournament scene, because if say a country has the cards printed in their language, maybe the tournament scene just isn't that happening, right? So it's like you just won't see a lot of those cards outside of that market in general. Whereas like Japan is like, people love TCGs, where people who play TCGs play at least a couple. And, even when you're there, you go to some card shops and there's just tons of cards, games that are pretty small here that are really, really popular there. And, of course, the US is like such a huge market too. Like you just,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, the amount printed in English is astronomical.
Well, it seems like with games like Magic the Gathering, no matter what language the card is printed in, it more or less mirrors the English printing. And, we always use the Oracle text because the English translation is always the de facto one in terms of rules. But I remember when I was deployed, I think it was 2014, I played in my first Korean draft. And the set had come out while I was underway. I had never seen any of the cards. I didn't get to see any of the spoilers. So I signed up for the draft. I got on my phone. I started like looking through all of the cards, the set, to try and, figure out what cards were good and which ones weren't. And then I sat down and, I think it was a really big draft pool. I think there was like 12 players or something like that. And it's just like trying to do the best I could with these cards that, if I didn't remember what it said, I just kind of like, well, power toughness looks okay and the casting cost is all right. So I'll take this one. And then, after I built the deck and then I was like trying to look up cards to remember, what I saw. And it was actually a lot of fun and super challenging, but I feel like you can't do something like that with Pokemon. Is that true? Like if I were to go to Korea right now and just buy a bunch of packs of a given set, would I get what I expect or how would that work?
So different versions of the game in different countries have a different number of cards. So like the idea of bulk or cards that are, just kind of like filler in packs, commons, uncommons, like that. In American packs, you have like these nice thick packs with 15 or so cards. When you go to Japan, they have a lot smaller packs where, you have one rare that, could either be a full art, a secret rare, a reverse foil, whatnot. The uncommon slot is smaller and the common slot is much, much smaller. So, the idea of drafting, even in those countries, is different. The way that people interact with the games is just different. So, like, a good example is like the Japanese booster box is a lot smaller, right? Because the packs are half the size. So they're able to fit in a lot smaller space. And the other thing is, like, for that particular printing of it too, they all have the hang tags, that little punched out top that you can put on hang it in a store and grab it off the little stick.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I remember learning that some of the packs are as few as 5 cards, and in some sets there's no guarantee of a rare. So you could open it and you get a couple commons and a couple uncommons, and that's it. It seems like it creates a lot more scarcity, especially for the players who, we only have so many packs, and you got to build a coherent deck. And then instead of getting 10 cards or 15 cards, you're only getting 5 per pack, and even fewer packs per box. It just seems like, it's not as good for the player in the long run, but maybe it is better for the collector because there's more natural scarcity.
Pokemon's definitely evolved over time. So, like, for Japanese Pokemon, I think it was kind of in that jungle fossil era of the Japanese printing of it. They moved to guaranteed holofoils in the rare slot. So you see a lot more Japanese holofoils from those sets than you do English, just because, every pack contained one, where in the US version, it was 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 or something like that. So, there's definitely been big differences between different language printings of, especially Pokemon in the past, where even the pull rates are different. And, it affects kind of, like you said, the scarcity and the price of those cards, just because, now you have like tons of this holofoil, in relation to the rest of the cards in the set. Whereas in the English, you don't necessarily have that.
I definitely noticed that with celebrations, right? Like, it's like there were some sets going for like $80, and you could open up that $80 box set and you would get $4 or $5 worth of cards because there was just so much available and so much getting opened that there was like EV was just not even a thing, right? EV being like your expected value or expected return from opening a box. Like, you opened it because you wanted those cards, not because, or the excitement of opening the packs, not because you expected to make any money off of the deal. Backing up a little bit though, early on in Magic, they had considered switching the backs for supplemental sets, and Arabian Nights was going to be the same color as its pack with that purple back, and ultimately they decided to veer away from that. Whereas with Pokemon, they kind of took a different path. Originally it started with those backs as Pocket Monsters when the game was originally released, in like early 90s in Japan. And then with the American or the English release, they changed the back. And then a few years after that, they ended up changing the Japanese back to like match more or less what the English version looked like, but not exactly. It's got a different colored border. It's got some extra features on it. And it really seemed like a weird thing to do. It splits the game. It doesn't make it cohesive. Like sleeves were kind of an up and coming thing where like Magic the Gathering at one point now required sleeves. So that way, like the backs weren't as important. But, as a game, it kind of seemed like they screwed themselves early on in terms of, promoting international sales to, English speaking customers. What do you think about that?
And in a way, it kind of, happens today still as well. If you look at, the celebration set in general, and you look at the foil treatments are different, on the front.
Different, yeah. Yeah. The surfaces are different. Yeah. The texture is different too.
Yeah. So like, even like, the Japanese has that shattered glass foil treatment on the border, whereas the English version just has, the standard yellow border. So like the Japanese versions of those holofoils pop a lot more. And I prefer them, right? From a collector's standpoint. The Japanese cards just also are on a little bit, it feels thicker. Like it feels like they're a lot more substantial of a card, than the English printing as well.
I think what that is, and having had measured the thickness of a few thousand cards, I can tell you that the thicknesses are almost always identical. They're very similar. They're within a hundredth of a millimeter. But the thing is that the Japanese printing uses it's either a more substantial glue or a more substantial paper that's a little more rigid, and it gives it that feel of being thicker. But I remember, not too long ago, you had mentioned something about Chinese Charizard set being released, and it kind of catching some of the buyers off guard. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the anomalies, I guess, in the Pokemon world is depending on what country you're in, there's a different number of SKUs of product, right? So, things that you can get in America or bundles you can get in America, especially big box, Target, Walmart, things like that, they'll have some exclusive things that you can kind of only get from those stores. Same thing in Japan. But one of the things most recently that happened was there's a Pokemon Sword and Shield Celebrations Charizard box where you're guaranteed a Charizard in the box as the promo, which collectors obviously clamor for, right? Charizard and Pikachu are the two at the very, very top of collectability. So people started buying this, and especially because Charizard's all over the box too. People would buy it, and then it's a surprise to them. And it's oh, this is in Chinese, because when you kind of just look at the packaging and things, on the front, it's not apparent that you have a Chinese language box. When you flip it around, it becomes a lot more apparent. But the text is small, and if you're just buying something and it's it's a foreign box anyway, and there's a guaranteed Charizard hit, you're oh, okay, great. But then, upon further inspection, and full disclosure, I bought one of them. One of my friends bought one of them too, keeping it sealed just because I think it's a cool piece of history. But this is probably for the vast majority of people, their first experience with Chinese language Pokemon cards.
It's pretty interesting. Speaking of Chinese cards, a lot of people don't know that Magic the Gathering is actually printed in two different Chinese languages. There's traditional and simplified. And to just a normal person who picks up one of those cards, they might look exactly the same. But just as a pro tip, if you're trying to figure out what the difference is, the one of them will have looks like a little period, but it's actually a circle, like a little Mardu. It'll be in the middle of the end of the text rather than at the bottom of the text. And that's actually found on the Chinese traditional. And so on the simplified, the period will look more like where an English period goes, which is at the very bottom right hand, justified at the end of a sentence. So just a little bit of info on that. But I think we're running up against the end of our time. So Grant, where can our viewers find you?
I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Chuggy_Bear. And if you have any questions about Magic or Pokemon, send me a message.
Awesome. And get in touch with us, see the episode description, or head over to ambergrading.com/TCG Compass. We'd love to hear from you.
That's our show for today. Thanks for joining us for the TCG Compass podcast. I've been your co-host, Chuggy.
And I've been your host, Daniel. We'll see you next time.
This has been the TCG Compass podcast, presented by Amber Grading. Thanks for listening. You can find us at ambergrading.com/TCG Compass, at Amber Grading on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or drop us an email, tcgcompass@ambergrading.com.